And I work with the U.S. Forest Service. I'm part of the Northern Research Station. Brian Palak is a colleague of mine, if he's still around anywhere. But I'm a research forester, and my emphasis in research is primarily silviculture, which is really broadly applied in terms of dealing with oak or pine regeneration issues, or in the last 10 or 15 years, restoring oak, pine, woodlands, and savannas. And you may have seen my name as a co-author with a lot of the fire history guys. I'm just a technical grunt when I go out with these guys and the pack mule that brings some of the wood out. But the reason that's a really valuable partnership for me is it helps inform my silviculture and help me think about how to design silvicultural prescriptions. And as you've maybe gotten a taste of some of the Evans and Mike's presentations today, there's a lot of information in fire history that we can learn about how to manage our fire to get the vegetation in a desired condition, or the habitats that we want for our wildlife, or to meet our conservation goals of in conserving and maintaining native biodiversity. So the first part of this talk is going to be just some highlights, overview of oak regeneration and oak fire ecology, some basic principles that would be helpful to know. And of course, it all starts with the regeneration process is with the acorn. There will be a couple of different applications of some of these basic principles. One will be in sustaining oak forest and getting good competitive regeneration. And then the other application will be in restoring oak savannas and woodlands. So let's start with the acorn. And oaks have to maintain a fairly high moisture content in their acorns, otherwise they lose their viability. And depending on the oak species, that can range anywhere from 25 to 45% moisture content. And so leaf litter actually helps acorns that get either buried in the soil or underneath the leaf litter to maintain some of that moisture content over the winter. You're blessed here to have permanent snowpack probably most years over the winter, and that helps your acorns remain viable. Down in my country, we often have bare ground through the winter, and so you can lose a lot of acorns just by them drying out over the winter time. But there is a point at which the leaf litter can become too thick, and then it becomes a physical barrier for any acorns laying on top of it to get their roots into the soil and establish themselves. And that's where fire does a really good job of managing the leaf litter. Mike Stambaugh has done a really nice paper looking at least in the central hardwood upland oak forest, how some of the dynamics of leaf litter accumulation. And we reach an equilibrium in about 12 or 15 years where decomposition is kind of equal to input. If you burn that off within 4 years after the fire, 75% of that equilibrium amount of leaf litter has already accumulated again. So if you're using fire to manage the seed bed in kind of a site preparation use of fire, you may have to periodically apply that until you get a good acorn crop. And once the acorns drop on the ground, oaks are very vulnerable to being the seed being killed by fire. And so if at all possible, it's probably not a good idea to do a prescribed burn right after a good mass crop. And so you should delay that. You can kill pretty much the entire seed crop with a low intensity fire. Even young oak seedlings are vulnerable to being killed by low intensity fire. And you can see as much as 60% mortality in 1-year-old northern red oak in a spring fire. So oftentimes animals, birds, squirrels, cache the seed in the mineral soil, and then sometimes they die or they get Alzheimer's or something and forget where that seed was buried. And that's good for the oak because being in the soil is a good place to be if you're going to be subjected to a prescribed fire, because soil is a poor conductor of heat generally. And so you can have 200, 600 degree Fahrenheit temperatures right at the ground level, and an inch in the soil, it'll just be 40 or 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's a good place to be if there's fire overhead. And that point where the shoot and the root come out of the acorn, as that seedling develops, it leaves a little scar there. And if you look at it, we call that the root collar. And at that point, there's a lot of dormant buds that, if they're in the soil, are protected from the fire. And so if the fire kills the stem, the above ground portion, those buds survive and they're able to resprout again. And their growth is fueled by the carbohydrates in the roots. Now, oaks have a strategy of preferentially allocating carbohydrates into the root system. And so they invest in a root system and not shoots, shoot growth in their juvenile period as a seedling. And this is a really good strategy where you're in an environment where there's frequent moderate to low to moderate intensity disturbances, like historic fire regimes that we've heard about this morning. It's a terrible strategy if you're out in the open and you're building a root system and there aren't any disturbances to knock back the competition, and you're growing with pioneer species that can grow really fast and shoot growth, then you just get suppressed and you die in the shade, because most oaks are shade intolerant, or at best intermediate in their tolerance to shade. Oak seedlings have relatively a better ability to withstand repeated fires than a lot of species, and that's where they get a competitive advantage in a regime of somewhat frequent fire. When I say that, I'm talking about like 3 to 5 years or somewhere in that range. This is a graph of some results of repeated burning, as many as 3 or 4 burns over a 10-year period down in the Ozarks. And you can see that down there, the flowering dogwood and black gum are some of the more major competitors with the oaks. And you can see what repeated fires does on the probability of survival. And that means survival, not of the original stem, it means survival of the root system, which is resprouting after each fire. So even for small diameter oak seedlings, there's a fairly high survival rate after one fire. You see some difference even among the oaks after repeated fires. You can see scarlet oak is less able to survive repeated fires, and small scarlet oaks are especially vulnerable, with only about 40% survival after 3 or 4 burns in 10 years. But you can see the effect of 3 or 4 burns in 10 years on it. Just about eliminates the black gum, and it really reduces the flowering dogwood. And so you can use this ability of oak to survive and persist in frequent fire regimes to your advantage. But if your oak seedlings are small, they're more vulnerable than if they're larger. And if you look at the diameters there, that's in centimeters. If you're at about 2 centimeters, a basal diameter on an oak seedling, you have a fairly high probability of surviving repeated fires. But how many, so that's about an inch in diameter. And how many of you have oak seedlings in your understory that are an inch in diameter at the ground? Probably not too many. They're more like 6 millimeters or something like that. That's a common diameter. And at least under current situations, the diameter of the seedling, the stem, is some reflection of how big the root system is. And so you can use this seedling stem diameter to kind of gauge, or you can dig a few of them up, but it's a pretty good indicator of the root mass. Larger oak trees or larger trees of any species have thicker bark than their seedlings, and bark thickness is like one of the major characteristics of bark that help insulate the cambium and protect it from the heat of fire. Now, our low intensity dormancies and burns, even the wimpiest burns, are hot enough to kill plant tissue. But trees use bark to protect their cambium. And here are some graphs that show some basic relationships between increasing bark thickness and the peak cambium temperature, or the time to kill the cambium, or the mortality of the stem. And you can see with 2 and 3 centimeters of bark thickness, you have quite a bit of protection of the cambium. And each species has some characteristic rate of bark accumulation, bark growth, and has a certain amount of bark thickness for any given size of the species. But there's great differences among the species. So fir oak, it has very good bark protection against prescribed fire or any kind of fire. Red maple, not so much, a thinner bark species. You can use that to your advantage depending on the size, structure, and bark thickness of your stands. But we heard from Lee that even what we call fire-sensitive species, if they get big enough, can have thick enough bark that you're not going to top kill them with any kind of prescribed fire you're willing to take a risk at running. You can kill overstory with prescribed fire, but the conditions that you need and the fire behavior you get is often, puts you at personal risk of your career in order to get the effect you want on the overstory. And at least in most cases, we have a lot of operable ground, and these trees are big and they're merchantable. And so it's much better to use a timber sale to go in and manage the overstory to achieve your structural goals. And the profits of your timber sale can be used to help you with your vegetation management or other restoration work. So here's just some examples of how you can kill really big trees, even oak trees, with a spring fire. And in this situation here, it was because there was a big treetop at the base of the oak. And Lee showed that with the northern pin oak and the fir oak restoration. And so that you can either use this to your advantage, or you can use it, this knowledge to protect the trees you want to survive the prescribed fire. So if you've had some kind of thinning or any kind of natural disturbance that creates activity fuel slash on the ground, you can move that away from your desired crop trees, or you can pile it up around the trees you want gone and use that to your advantage. Now, if a tree gets wounded, they have, to varying extents, depending on the species, the ability to form a boundary layer around that injury, and we call that compartmentalization. And the oaks are much better at compartmentalizing injuries than other species, and white oaks are a whole lot better than red oaks. And when you consider the decay resistance of heartwood, here's some results from our forest products lab in Madison. And you can see that the white oaks have very resistant heartwood, resistant to decay, and the red oaks don't. They're very sensitive. And Lee used that pin oak as an example, where it gets wounded and it rots like this and it falls down. So white oaks are a whole lot more resistant to decay, and they're better able to take a wound, compartmentalize it, control the decay that develops in it, minimize the wound. Joe's going to talk about value and volume loss from fire injury in oaks. And so you'll be hearing more about that in a few minutes. But white oaks are really good about minimizing the negative impacts of fire on volume and value loss. And there's also ecological benefit to that too, because if you're restoring a post oak or a bur oak or a white oak, woodland or savanna, regular fire is going to be a part of that management. And you don't really you want your desired overstory trees to survive, live out their longevity. And so you don't want them being wounded and decaying quickly and falling over in an ice storm or a windstorm. So fortunately for us, white oaks are good, persistent overstory trees if they can get there. What do we know about acorn production? It varies with tree age and tree diameter and characteristics of the crown. It's not all trees are good acorn producers. There is genetic variability there. It's the dominant trees, the big crown trees that are going to be better able to reach their genetic potential in acorn production. And production peaks, in this graph, around 50 centimeters DBH, and then it declines. And so if you have good acorn producers in your stand, don't take them out in a thinning, protect them from mortality from prescribed fires. If you have the luxury, know who those producers are and thin around them and give them, crown space to give you maximum production. You got to have acorn production if you want natural regeneration to occur. So this is an important component of the stand. If you don't have it, you're looking at artificial regeneration to get oak back into the stand. I think I'm going to speed up here. There's sources of regeneration: seedlings, seedling sprouts, and stump sprouts. And new seedlings are not competitive at all. Seedling sprouts increase quite a bit in their ability to compete. The larger the root system is, the larger the basal stem diameter is, that indicates a large root system. And stump sprouts are the most competitive, fastest growing source of reproduction. The only problem is that not all stumps produce sprouts. And so you need to rely on what we call advanced regeneration if you want to maintain oak stocking at the current level or at an increased level. I'm going to pass through some of these pretty quick. It's just there's the stump sprouts. So the key to sustaining oak stocking is to have adequate large advanced reproduction. And this takes time. It's a process. It's not an event. You can't think about regenerating oak the year you're going to do your timber harvest. You got to be working on it 10 or 20 years ahead of the actual regeneration harvest that releases the advanced regeneration or creates the stump sprouts. And here's the most common situation in our oak forest is that they're mature, they're vertically complex, there's less than 5% of full sunlight in the understory. That's not enough for any oak species to grow at all. You get a mass crop, you get seedlings that grow to be 6 inches tall, 6 millimeters in diameter from the energy in the acorn, then that's exhausted, and then they start dying off. And within 10 years, a bumper crop of acorns can produce a cohort of seedlings, and in 10 years, they're practically gone. That example is with northern red oak. So how do you control light in the understory? By controlling overstory density and other layers of vegetation. So what's the first thing you have to do if you want to promote oak regeneration? First, make sure you have it in the understory before you release it. I've seen a lot of people show me their shelterwood harvest and they want oak regeneration and they say, what do you think? And I look around and there's no oak seedlings in the understory, but there's 250,000 sugar maple seedlings there. I go, well, I think you did a good job of releasing the maple. And now your problem's, you know, even more expensive and hard. So what do we know about stand structure and light levels in the understory of an oak forest? Well, here's a graph for upland oak forest in Missouri. And you can develop something like this pretty easily for your forest types in your areas too. And it's very helpful in helping you make some of your management decisions and set your targets for prescription. And so here is stand stocking on the x-axis and percent of what? The black line is percent of photosynthetically active radiation in the understory, and the dotted line is crown cover percent. And so you can see you actually have to, oaks do really well in general, somewhere between 30 and 50% of full sunlight in the understory. So what do you have to do if you have a fully stocked stand to get there? Well, 30 to 50%, the red lines, you got to be somewhere around 40 to 60% stand stocking. And I'm talking about Gingrich stocking chart stocking. And 60% stocking is somewhere around B level stocking on the Gingrich, which is right at the bottom of the point of being a fully stocked stand. And so you actually have to thin the stand pretty hard to get that amount of light in the understory. We often go too tentatively or conservatively when we're thinning our stands and we don't open them up enough. So wait until it's the right time to open them up, and then open them up an adequate amount. Now, what do you do when you release the oak? You release all the other vegetation too. So you can't just do a thinning without some kind of other vegetation management. And prescribed fire is a good tool for that. And so those go well together, but you can't just thin and do nothing else because you're going to lose your oak. Most of our understories are full of other vegetation, whether it's other woodies or it's just other herbaceous stuff that comes on. And in the worst case scenario, it's, you know, bush honeysuckle or something else like that is part of the deal too, which complicates life. It's just so interesting to me now, these little bubbles down here that say savanna and woodlands, based on general land office survey witness tree information, we've done analyses in Missouri, and we've used those tree records to estimate tree size, tree density, and from that you can get stand stocking. And so we've defined our historic woodlands, at least the ones that were around when the surveyors went through. We're able to more quantitatively define them. And in Missouri, you know, it's like 30% to 75% stocking is the range of stocking you have for systems we define as we call woodlands. And I think it's interesting that spans the desired range of light to promote oak regeneration. And then there's even more light, of course, in the savannas. So savannas and woodlands are good habitats for oak seedlings to get enough light to grow. And they're very well adapted to repeated fire. And so when you put those two together, oaks can persist in the understory for decades and decades. And Mike Stanball and I, with Justin D., a postdoc, looked at aging oak root systems in a Kansas oak woodland. And we found some root systems that were 50 years old, you know, and they had a root like a yam or something. And because they had enough light to build root, in between the fires. And so oaks can persist in these kind of environments really well. That's why when we stop burning, you get reports like the papers written by Grimm and others that within 20 years after stop burning, the savanna went to a forest because those grubs, those oak sprouts are all out there. You may not see them unless you walk around because of all the grass and herbaceous material that's out there too. but they're there. And John made a really good observation this morning when he laughed and said, just try to restore a savanna and then quit. That's how you get your oak forest. And I've said that same thing. And, you know, I laugh when I say it, but I'm damn serious. You know, I've spent my whole life trying to regenerate oaks and promote oaks. And when you're working with savanna and woodland restoration, they want you to kill trees and kill oaks, you know, but in working with them and trying to kill them, I learned how to grow them, you know. And it's like we need to get the foresters and the restorationists together and start talking to each other, because the restorationists have the answer for the foresters. So you need to reduce stand density. And how do you do that? With the larger trees, the most efficient way and profitable way is to do commercial timber harvest, thinning, or regenerate, you know, and to get there. This is an example from Missouri of annual burning, or burning every 4 years in what started out to be a mature oak forest. And after 60 years, the red and the blue line are the annual burn and the burn every 4 years. We finally just got into the upper range of stand stocking in what we call woodland ecosystems. And so that's a lot of burning for 60 years to get there, and you can get there now in a timber sale. So somebody said burn it for 2,000 years and you'll be there. Yeah, that's one approach. Or, you know, you can combine fire with other techniques to get the job done efficiently, profitably, effectively. The kinds of prescribed fires we normally do are good at taking out, or at least top killing, any hardwood species up to about 4 inches in diameter. And when they get bigger than that, then we wound them, and maybe with repeated fires, they decay and fall down. But generally, we may have to go in there and do something else to, if your mid-story is dominated by stems greater than 4 inches in diameter, some people hack and spray or just mechanically fell them. But generally, prescribed burning is not as efficient a way of dealing with trees of that size class. Well, this is just saying you can kill big trees. I always laugh and put this out. I hope I never run into the manager of this property in the audience, but this I got from Joe. This was an attempt to restore a post oak woodland out in Oklahoma, and it was invaded by cedars. So they dropped all the cedars on the ground, and then they burned it, and they killed all their post oaks. So it is possible with prescribed burning to kill big trees, but you probably don't want to do it that way. I'm not going to go through this. These are just typical silviculture regeneration methods: single tree selection, group selection, shelterwood, clear cut. And I guess my only point here is it's, you know, single tree selection and fire generally don't go so well together, because the fire is knocking out your seedling and sapling class, and it just totally screws up the whole concept of single tree selection management and stand development under that system. And then when you have little group openings within a matrix that's often used or harvested by single tree selection, it's hard to apply the prescribed fire in those little group openings to control vegetation. So the regeneration method, those regeneration methods in prescribed burning, probably in most cases don't really work very well together. But the more even age methods of regeneration and prescribed burning work very well together. And you know, when you finally get the advanced reproduction big enough and numerous enough to feel like you're able to, where are we at? 1 minute? Okay. Release it, then fire after release is really good. And generally, the hotter you can burn it, the better. And so, you know, post clear cut, post final release is a good time to use prescribed burning. But then at some point, you want the oaks to grow up. And so you have to quit burning. And then they need to get big enough to where they can survive the next fire when you start reapplying it, if you are going to reapply it for other resource reasons, whether it's biodiversity or wildlife habitat or whatever. That threshold diameter varies, but it may take 20 or 30 years to get there. And that's a real logistical operational challenge for you all. If you have to keep burning for other reasons, how do you let those oaks or enough of those oaks recruit into the overstory to maintain a savanna or a woodland overstory while in the face of continued burning? And so that's a problem you all are going to have to solve. But I have seen people be so crazy as to go out and individually around certain crop trees, you know, remove the fuel, blow a fire line around them to protect them. You can do that on 100 acres. You probably can't do it on 10,000 acres or 1,000,000 acres. But when you burn, don't burn it completely black. Let it have some variability in how it burns that area. And there will be natural pockets out there, rock outcrops, wet areas, or just aspects and exposures where leaf litter gets blown around. And so over time, some of those trees will make it up into the overstory. And it's a whole different way of thinking when you're dealing with savannas and woodlands, because those overstories, I mean, those trees can live to be 350 years old. You know, we're used to thinking of 60, 80-year rotations or 100-year rotations. How does your management change when the rotation is 300 years? You know, and so that is really going to affect, you know, the overall stand prescription. And I'll just end with that right now. Great. Save Joe some time.
All right.
Yeah,
thanks, Dan.
Thanks. Yeah.
All right, next up is Joe Marshall. I have his slides, I do.